SANDHAN, All Gujarat Integrated Classroom.
સેટેલાઇટના માધ્યમથી જોડતી કડી એટલે સંધાન.
Hello, my dear students, and of course the faculty members who are listening to this interesting lecture. Why do I call it interesting? Because we are now going to be looking at types of comedy. Comedy is something which always attracts us, because anything that makes us smile is something that we love to look at. Look at, read on and on. Look at these smiling faces that you see. You could be laughing for different reasons. You could be laughing in different ways. You could be laughing at the characters. You could be laughing with the characters. All this is what comedy makes us do. Remember, we are going to be talking about types of comedy. But before I go to that, let us very quickly look at drama, types of drama. Then we move on to types of comedy. Drama, of course, you know, is as old as literature. No, we should be saying it's much, much older than literature. Literature, I mean written literature. Drama was something that was enacted, maybe at street corners, maybe on special occasions, maybe on those moving carts. Remember the miracle and mystery plays? Well then, drama can be divided into tragedy and comedy. Tragedy, you might say, you might understand as anything that makes us cry. Comedy, anything that makes us laugh. That is the basic difference. But then, of course, there are many more differences between tragedy and comedy. But since today's lecture is on types of comedy, let us for the moment focus only on comedy before we move on to the types of comedy. I should like to begin with a simple definition of comedy. Remember, I said comedy makes you laugh. Well, what does the dramatist do? What does the writer do? What does the writer of comedy do? He looks at the world, the same world at which probably the tragic dramatist is also looking. Of course, the same world, but then he looks at something different. Something different, some facet of life which is different. He also looks at it in a different kind of way. So what shall we define comedy as? A way of looking at the world in which basic values are asserted, but natural laws suspended. Because what is he looking at? What is he concentrating on? What does he want to draw your attention to? Human follies and foolishness. Remember, comedy, the comic vision, making the audience or the reader laugh at what? At human follies and foolishness. Remember, this is what makes us smile, makes us laugh, maybe sometimes even guffaw. So, this comedy could be wry, could be rueful, could be hilarious. Hilarious is when all of us laugh together and we think that we can never stop laughing. That is hilarious. But wry, my dear students, when you wish that the character had not behaved like that. You wish things could have been different, because there is a rueful, oh, I wish it had not happened kind of behavior. Of course, we laugh, but then the characters are not in a very happy situation. I would also like to define comedy for you as a genre of dramatic literature. Remember, I already began by telling you that we have two kinds of drama, tragedy and comedy. So what is comedy? It is a genre of dramatic literature. Genre, my dear friends, you might wonder why the word is pronounced like that. Of course, we could easily use the easier word literary form. But remember, you are students of literature, and therefore you want to learn the appropriate technical term. And a wonderful way of talking about literary form is to use the word genre. Doesn't matter if you're not able to pronounce it that way, but remember the spelling, and remember, because it is a word of French origin, we pronounce it as genre. So what does it deal with? What does a comedy deal with? It deals with the light and amusing. Or it could be dealing with the serious and the profound, but it does that in a light, familiar, or satirical manner. Remember, in the first definition of the word comedy, of the genre comedy, I talked about rueful and wry. So when there is an element of satire, that is when probably the laughter is wry and rueful. So it is a light and amusing form of dramatic literature. It's also interesting to note that the characters in a tragedy are different from the characters in a comedy. What do I mean by that? I mean to draw your attention to the fact that tragic writers usually have kings and ministers and people of a certain social strata, because, as a beautifully put by one of the greatest writers, when an oak tree falls, it crushes everything around it. So when you have tragic characters, obviously with their downfall, with their tragedy, with the tragic results of their actions, it is not only they that are affected, also affected are the people around them. And that is why the characters in a tragedy belong to a particular strata of society. Whereas when we move to comedy, when we look at characters who are in a comedy, you would notice that they are usually common people, because the writer makes a clear distinction between what happens when tragedy befalls a great person. In contrast, the characters of comedy are individuals by themselves. Even when the writer is laughing at a particular class, yet what we see on the stage, what we read in comedy, is about one character. Let us go on and look at what are the kinds of comedy. Here I'm making a very, very basic distinction between high comedy and low comedy. I've called it the ladder of comedy because if you begin walking up dramatic literature, the comedy, you would notice that we could begin at the very bottom and walk upwards, the ascent. Or let's begin at the very top and walk downwards. So in the ladder of comedy, one could look at pure comedy or high comedy, where you have satire, biting humor. It could be the criticism of life. It could be highly complex. It is what one would call high comedy, or what one would place at the top of comedy. Where one could place maybe the comedy of Shaw, what we call the comedy of ideas. Maybe where we could place some of Shakespeare's comedies. Maybe not something like Midsummer Night's Dream, but certainly something like All's Well That Ends Well. So you have the ladder, where we are talking about high comedy, where you see intellectual wit. And if you come down, remember, I'm talking about a ladder where we have begun at the very top. If we want to come down, we could come to low comedy. And what is low comedy? It is where the writer, the dramatist, uses plot devices in order to make us laugh. What are these plot devices? It could be misunderstandings. It could be mistaken identities, twin brothers. We've seen that in a lot of our Indian movies too. You've seen that in a number of stories that you have read, novels maybe, short stories maybe, where there are alikes, two brothers, two sisters looking so alike that one is mistaken for the other. Now in such comedies, where we are talking about the low comedy, in such comedies, everything depends on action and situation, which means language, which means intellectual wit probably gets reduced in importance. Here we could also talk about farces, which of course I will be looking at in greater detail. So what have we done, my dear students? We have attempted to define comedy and to talk about two kinds of comedy. What are the sources of laughter? Remember, when we're talking about comedy, what we are going to do is to laugh. Who's this we? It could be the reader of a play. It could be the audience who is watching a comedy. I'm sure all of you have read some sort of comedy, some sort of maybe book where there is the comic element that you just can't stop laughing. Where does this laughter come? What are the sources of laughter? They could be of different kinds. They could be of different levels. They may evoke different kinds of laughter. Remember, we are talking about the source of laughter. That is, if you are reading or watching a comedy, what is it about that comedy that makes you laugh? They are of different kinds, they are of different levels, and this is what gives us the way in which gives us an idea, gives us a sort of a yardstick to measure where to put the comedy, where to put it in the ladder of comic literature. I'm using the word comic literature because though I'm going to be talking about drama, I want you to remember that the comic element is not restricted only to drama. Comedy as a literary form, my dear students, is a part of dramatic literature. But comedy or the comic element can be found in all forms of literature. Why? I would even like to say it can be found in all forms of art. Well, after all, in a cartoon, what are you seeing? It could be the animated cartoon or it could be the cartoon pictures, the graphics maybe that you see. I'm talking about what is it that causes laughter. So, let's look at the sources. I've sort of tried to identify for you 4 major sources of laughter in a comedy. One could be physical deformity. It could be mental deformity. It could be incongruity, and it could be obsession. This is a low kind of comedy, or the laughter, or the kind of writing that leads to this kind of laughter can never be a part of very high comedy. Because what are we laughing at here? What is the source of laughter here? My dear students, of course we do laugh in life too when we see such incongruities. What do I mean? A thin, short, weak-looking person by the side of a tall, well-built, strong person. And what's happening in this comedy is that weak man is trying to push down the strong man. Isn't it an incongruity? You know, it's like in our old children's joke where the ant, that small creature, imagining that it can knock down an elephant. My dear students, this is not to discount the importance of the small, because after all, small is also beautiful. But I'm talking to you here about the sources of laughter. And therefore, one source of laughter could be this, could be physical deformity, could be mental deformity, could be obsessions, somebody wanting to do the same thing again and again and again. It's an obsession. And you keep probably counting the number of times the character has done that. That's a kind of addiction or an obsession. It can also be caused by incongruity. 2 things which cannot exist side by side. The common word that you might be using is a word like absurd. It's not possible. It's not something as serious as dichotomy, but certainly it is an absurd situation. This source of laughter that I'm talking about, another source can be amusing situations. Amusing situations, when you find the character in a wrong place. It could be an amusing situation. You must have seen this in ever so many stories, I'm sure, very common in many of our movies. The person you're trying to run away with, you come face to face with that person. it could be a source of laughter. So it could be amusing situations. It could be ridiculous or awkward manners. For example, if somebody bows too low, if somebody, right, shows an over arching desire to please, to flatter, to say good things about something, that could also lead to comedy. Because comedy, remember, always depends on exaggeration. That is not to say that it is not based in reality. Maybe it is realistic, but the laughter arises because of the incongruity. And remember, one of the incongruities, one of the sources is, of course, exaggeration. So if the situation is ridiculous, is awkward manners, and if it keeps happening again and again and again, remember, repeatedly doing the same thing, it could lead to a great deal of laughter. That's again one of the sources of laughter. What about the third one? Here we are talking about expression. That means we are talking about language. We are talking about probably the wrong word. You think you know the word. And remember, we have a figure of speech, which some of you probably know, and it is called malapropism. Comes from a character, Mrs. Malaprop, in one of our restoration plays. Of course, I'm going to be talking about restoration comedy a little later in this lecture. But for this moment, let me just talk to you about the use of language to evoke laughter. And the example that I would like to give you here is a malapropism. You know, you think you know the word and you use the wrong word. For example, if I talk to you about a legible bachelor, remember, my dear students, all of you know, it's handwriting which is legible or illegible. And characters, bachelor, for example, has to be either eligible or ineligible. For a split second, you might not even notice the difference. But if it is